Iran's president is warning America will regret reimposing sanctions on his country. US President Donald Trump withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in May. The first round of renewed punitive measures are now in effect, and they cover the purchase of US dollars and trade in gold, metals and automobiles. In November, more damaging sanctions against oil exports go into effect. And the move puts Washington at odds with the UK, France, Germany, Russia and China. Hassan Rouhani says China and Russia have indicated they won't abide by the measures.
If someone is willing to use a knife against an opponent, stabs that opponent while simultaneously saying that we wish to establish a dialogue and converse with one another, the first requirement is for them to extract the knife from the body of that opponent before establishing dialogue. So I think the aim here is to sow doubt within the mind of the Iranian nation, as well as use that to their advantage somehow in the upcoming midterm congressional elections. It's a psychological warfare against the people of Iran.
The European Union's Federica Mogherini reacted to the sanctions.
We are working within the European Union and with other partners in the world, among them New Zealand, but also Asian partners, to protect investments and to keep channels open, especially when it comes to the trade of oil and petrochemicals, but also when it comes to banking channels and financial channels.
And for more on this, New York Times correspondent Thomas Erdbrink joined us now on the phone from Tehran. Thanks so much for being with us. So I want to ask you, what do you think the impact will likely be of these sanctions on Iran's economy?
Well, we've already been seeing the impact of the threat of sanctions in the past months. The Iranian currency, the rial, has devaluated. If you take it in a year-to-year basis, it has lost over 80% of its value. Now, this has been a shock to many Iranians, and subsequently a lot of prices have gone up here. Naturally, a lot of Iranians are fearing unemployment because of these sanctions. They target the auto industry, for instance, which is a very big employer in this country. People generally fear that it will lead to more isolation and more problems for the Iranian economy. At the same time, people also blame their own leaders for some of the problems in the economy. They point at the big corruption cases that we've seen here, and also the many instances of mismanagement of the economy, something that President Rouhani even partly admitted last night as he was speaking to the Iranian nation. Rosemary.
So how likely is it, do you think, that these restored sanctions will eventually force Iran back to the negotiating table?
Well, if you look at the previous round of sanctions between 2009 roughly and 2013, then you can see that they did help in bringing Iran to the negotiating table. Of course, that's something that Iranian leaders view differently. They said that they, by their own choice, went to debate and eventually came up with a compromise that we now usually refer to as the nuclear deal. President Rouhani last night didn't rule out direct talks with Donald Trump. He said that if the U.S. takes some certain steps, shows more sincerity, then Iran might consider talking directly to America. And of course, in September, both leaders are likely to run into each other at the annual meeting of the United Nations that will take place that month. So that could be a venue where these two leaders might possibly meet or talk.
All right, we will be watching and seeing what happens, of course, what the outcome is of these sanctions being reimposed. Thomas Erdbrink, many thanks to you. So let's get more on this with Genevieve Abdo. She is a resident scholar with the Arabia Foundation and author of the book Mecca and Main Street. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Well, President Trump said he was open to talks with Iran's leadership. Tehran rejected his offer initially, but now Iran's president says he will talk to Mr. Trump right now. What changed his mind? The pressure of restored sanctions or something else?
Well, if you look at his speech closely, which he gave several hours ago today, he didn't necessarily say he would talk to the U.S. He said that, I think as he put it, once the knife is removed, I will speak to the U.S. The knife meaning the sanctions. So he's not, I think, based on what he said today, he is not willing to talk under the current conditions. He wants the sanctions first to be lifted.
Yeah, and of course, we know that the United States won't do that.
Right.
President Rouhani said Iran has always welcomed dialogue and negotiations. Is that the case?
Well, they've welcomed dialogue and negotiations somewhat on their terms. And from the view of the Trump administration, which is at the time that the nuclear agreement, which is the focus of this whole conversation, at the time that it was negotiated and then signed in 2015, there was somewhat of a different kind of debate in Washington that exists today. At the time, the Obama administration believed that by negotiating with Iran, this would make Iran more compliant on other issues, not just their nuclear program. The other issues being their militarization in the Arab world. So their military activity in Iraq and Syria, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and then, of course, in Yemen. But since that time, what we have seen, actually, is an increase in military activity, an tremendous increase in spending on Iran's proxy. So what the Obama administration had hoped would happen, which is that Iran would curtail its nuclear program, and then the United States would then be able to negotiate on other issues, really hasn't happened. So that's why there is this very fierce effort by the Trump administration to hold Iran accountable on its military activity in the Middle East, and this is really what's driving the withdrawal from the nuclear agreement, because from the Trump administration perspective, they don't really see any progress.
Right. And President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, is calling Iran's response here propaganda. Is that what it is?
I think so, frankly. I actually was a correspondent for The Guardian in Iran for a number of years, so I know the country well. And I think that they do play with words. And so we're seeing a lot of rhetoric on both sides. I don't know. You could ask the question of the Trump administration. Were they really sincere about their invitation to talk to the Iranians? We don't know. But I do think that today's speech by President Rouhani and many statements that have been made by Revolutionary Guard commanders, by the Supreme Leader himself, since May 12th, when President Trump withdrew from the Iran agreement, the nuclear agreement, have not been all that truthful.
Yeah, and on that point, President Rouhani, he emphasized the fact that Mr. Trump has backed out of previous dialogue with Tehran and has withdrawn from international agreements. Is that the U.S. president's Achilles heel?
Well, you know, I have to say that it doesn't lend much credibility to the U.S. government. The U.S. government signed a nuclear agreement with EU member states, with Iran, that they then later reneged upon. So from on that very point, yes, you could say, make a very legitimate argument that the United States has not kept its promise. Meanwhile, on the other hand, there has been no evidence so far to date from the Atomic Energy Agency, for example, from the UN, that Iran violated the agreement. So if you look at it strictly in those terms, the Iranian government has a point. But if you look at it in the broader context of what was negotiated and the details of the agreement, I think that's where we get into much more sophisticated arguments and questions about why this deal was even signed to begin with.
Right. Geneva Abdo, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your analysis with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you.